Continuing Phocion in Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Phocion, who had never touched his pay, now, so far as the public interest would admit of it, showed some regard to his particular security. This encouraged him once more to try his inclinations, and upon further survey, finding that he himself was a fortress, inaccessible on every quarter to the approaches of corruption, he professed a particular friendship to Phocion's son-in-law, Charicles, and admitting him into his confidence in all his affairs, and continually requesting his assistance, he brought him under some suspicion. Upon the occasion, for example, of the death of Phocion, who was Harpalyc's mistress, for whom he had a great fondness, and had a child by her, he resolved to build her a sumptuous monument, and committed the care of it to his friend Charicles. The commission, disreputable enough in itself, was yet further disparaged by the piece of workmanship made after it was finished. It is yet to be seen in the Hermenum, as you go from Athens to Eleusis, with nothing in its appearance answerable to the sum of 30 talents, with which Charicles is said to have charged Harpalyce for its erection. After Harpalyce's own decease, his daughter was educated by Phocion, by Charicles, with great care. But when Charicles was called to account for his dealings with Harpalyce, and entreated his father-in-law's protection, begging that he would appear for him in the court, Phocion refused, telling him, "I did not choose you for my son-in-law for any but honorable purposes." Asclepiadus, the son of Hipparchus, brought the first tidings of Alexander's death to Athens, which Demades told them was not to be credited, for were it true, the whole world would ere this have stunk with the dead body. But Phocion, seeing that the people, eager for an instant revolution, did his best to quiet and repress them, and when numbers of them rushed up to the hustings to speak, and cried out that the news was true and Alexander was dead, "If he is dead today," said, "he will be so tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow equally, so that there is no need to take counsel hastily, or before it's safe." When Leosthenes now had embarked the city in the Lamian war, greatly against Phocion's wishes, to raise a laugh against Phocion, he asked him scoffingly, what the state had been benefited by his having now so many years been general. "It is not a little," said Phocion, "that the citizens have been buried in their own sepulchres." And when Leosthenes continued to speak boldly and boastfully in the assembly, "Young man," he said, "your speeches are like cypress trees, stately and tall, and no fruit to come of them." When he was then attacked by Hipparchus, who had asked him when the time would come that he would advise the Athenians to make war, "As soon," said he, "as I find young men to keep their ranks, the rich men contributed their money, and the orators leaving off robbing the treasury." Afterwards, when many, see, that's what it should be. If a bunch of rich people want wars, that, no one's defending each other, we're not defending our country, etc., etc. Let these people who stand up and whatnot and clamor about, let them pay for it. Afterwards, when many admired the forces raised and the preparations for war that were made by Leosthenes, they asked Phocion how he approved of the new levies. "Very well," said he, "for the short course, but what I fear is the long race. However late the war may last, The city has neither money, ships, nor soldiers, but these, that events justified his prognostics. At first, all things appeared fair and promising. Leosthenes gained great reputation by worsting the Boeotians in battle, and driving Antipater within the walls of Lamia, and the citizens were so transported with the first successes that they kept solemn festivities for them, and offered public sacrifices to the entities that they considered to be gods and goddesses. Well, you don't necessarily wait till things are private, right? People are like, well, I don't, because you have to do your rituals in private. It's like, to some extent, no. So that some thinking Phocion must now be convinced of his error, asked him whether he would not willingly have been author of these successful actions. Yes, said he, most gladly, but also of the former counsel. And when one expires, after another came from the camp, confirming and magnifying the victories. When, said he, will the end of them come? Leosthenes soon after was killed. And now those that feared lest, if Phocion obtained the command, he would put an end to the war, arranged with an obscure person in the assembly who should stand up and profess himself to be a friend and an old confidant of Phocion's, and persuade the people to spare him at this time, and reserve him with whom none could compare for a more pressing occasion, and now to give Antiphilus the command of the army. This pleased the generality, but Phocion made it appear he was so far from having any friendship with him of the old standing, that he had not so much as the least familiarity with him. Yet now, sir, said he, give me leave to put you down among the numbers of my friends and well-wishers, as you have given a piece of advice so much to my advantage. When the people were eager to make an expedition against the Boeotians, he at first opposed it, and on his friends telling him the people would kill him for always running counter to them. That will be unjust of them, he said, if I give them honest advice. If not, it will be just of them. But if he found them persisting and shouting to him to lead them out, he commanded the crier to make proclamations that all the Athenians under 60 should instantly provide themselves with 5 days' provision and follow him from the assembly. This caused a great tumult. Those in years were startled and clamored against the order, and demanded wherein he injured them. For I, says he, am now 80, and am ready to lead you. This succeeded in pacifying them for the present. But when Phocion, with a large force of Macedonians and mercenaries, began to pillage the sea-coast, having made a descent upon Rhamnus and overrun the neighboring country, Phocion led out the Athenians to attack him, and when sundry private persons came, intermeddling with his dispositions, and telling him that they ought to occupy such a hill, detach the cavalry in this or that direction, engage the enemy on this point or that. O Hercules, says he, how many generals have we here, and how few soldiers? Afterwards, having formed the battle, one who wished to show his bravery advanced out of his post before the rest, but on the enemy's approaching, lost heart and retired back into his rank. Young man, said Phocion, are you not ashamed twice in one day to desert your station? First, that on which I had placed you, and secondly, on that which you had placed yourself. However, he entirely routed the enemies, killing Phocion and many more on the spot. The Grecian army also in Thessaly, after Leonatus, and the Macedonians who came with him out of Asia, had arrived and joined Antipater, and fought and beat them in a battle. Leonidas was killed in the fight. Antiphilus, commanding the foot, and Memnon, the Thessalian, the horse. But not long after, Craterus crossed from Asia with numerous forces. A pitched battle was fought at Cranon. The Greeks were beaten, though not indeed in a signal defeat, nor with any great loss of men, but what with their want of obedience to their commanders, who were young and overindulgent with them, and what with Antipater's tampering and treating with their separate cities one by one, the end of it was that the army was dissolved, and the Greeks shamefully surrendered the liberty of their country upon the news of Antipater's now advancing at once against Athens with all his force. Demosthenes and Hyperides deserted the city, and Demedes, who was altogether insolvent for any part of the fines that had been laid upon him by the city, for he had been condemned no less than 7 times for introducing bills contrary to the laws, and who had been disenfranchised, and was no longer competent to vote in the assembly, laid hold of the season of impunity to bring in a bill for sending ambassadors with plenipotentiary power to Antipater to treat about a peace. But the people distrusted him, and called upon Phocion to give his opinion, as the person they only and entirely confided in. He told them, if my former counsels had been prevalent with you, we had not been reduced to deliberate on the question at all. However, the vote passed, and a decree was made, and he, with others, deputed to go to Antipater, who lay now encamped in the Theban territories, but intended to dislodge immediately and pass into Attica. Phocion's first request was that he would make the treaty without moving his camp, and when Craterus declared that it was not fair to ask them to be burdensome to the country of their friends and allies by their stay, when they might rather use that of their enemies for provisions and the support of their enemy, Antipater, taking him by the hand, said, "We must grant that this favor to Phocion. For the rest, he bade them return to their principles, and acquaint them that he could only offer them the same terms, namely to surrender at discretion, which Leosthenes had offered to him when he was shut up in Lamia." When Phocion had returned to the city and acquainted them with this answer, they made a virtue of necessity and complied, since it would be no better. So Phocion returned to Thebes with the other ambassadors, and among the rest, Xenocrates the philosopher, the reputation of whose virtue and wisdom was so great and famous everywhere that they conceived that there could not be any pride, cruelty, or anger arising in the heart of man, which would not, at the mere sight of him, be subdued into something of reverence and admiration. But the result, as it happened, was the very opposite. Antipater showed such a want of feeling and such a dislike of goodness. He saluted everyone else, but would not so much as notice Xenocrates, they tell us, observed upon it, that Antipater, when meditating such cruelty to Athens, did well to be ashamed of seeing him. When he began to speak, he would not hear him, but broke in and rudely interrupted him, until at last he was obliged to be silent. But when Phocion had declared the purport of their embassy, he replied shortly that he would make peace with the Athenians on these occasions, and no others, that Demosthenes and Hyperides should be delivered up to him, that they should retain their ancient form of government, the franchise being determined by a property qualification, that they should receive a garrison into Manukia and pay a certain sum of the cost of war. As things stood, these terms were judged tolerable by the rest of the ambassadors. Xenocrates only said that if Antipater considered the Athenian slaves, he was treating them fairly, but if free, severely. Phocion pressed him only to spare them the garrison, and used many arguments and entreaties. Antipater replied, Phocion, we are ready to do you any favor which would not bring ruin both on ourselves and on you. Others report it differently, that Antipater asked Phocion, supposing he remitted the garrison to the Athenians, would he, Phocion, stand surety for the cities observing the terms and attempting no revolution? And when he hesitated and did not at once reply, Calimedon the Carbarus, a hot partisan and professed enemy of the free states, cried out, and if he should talk so idly, Antipater, will you be so much abused as to believe him and not carry out your own purpose? So the Athenians received the garrison, and Menelaus for the governor, a fair-dealing man, and one of Phocion's acquaintances. But the proceeding seemed sufficiently imperious and arbitrary, indeed rather a spiteful and insulting ostentation of power, than that the possession of the fortress would be of any great importance. The resentment felt upon it was heightened by the time it happened in, for the garrison was brought in on the 20th of the month of Boedramion. It would, I don't even know if it's in the preface, but yeah, I don't remember which month Boedramion is. Just at that time of the great festival, when they carry forth Iacchus with solemn pomp from the city to Eleusis, so that the solemnity being disturbed, many began to call to mind instances, both ancient and modern, of divine interventions and intimations. For in old time, upon the occasion of their happiest successes, the presence of the shapes and voices of the mystic ceremonies have been vouchsafed to them, striking terror and amazement into their enemies. But now, at the very season of their celebration, the entities themselves stood witness of the saddest oppressions of Greece, the most holy time being profaned, and the greatest jubilee made of unlucky date of their most extreme calamity. Not many years before, they had warning from the oracle at Dodona that they should carefully guard the summits of Diana, lest haply strangers should seize them. And about this time, when they dyed the ribbons and garlands with which they adorned the couches and cars of the procession, instead of a purple, they received only a faint yellow color, and to make the omen yet greater, of all the things which were dyed for common use, took the natural color. When a candidate for initiation was washing a young pig in the haven of Cantharus, a shark seized him, bit off his lower parts up to belly, and devoured them, by which the entity gave them manifestly to understand that, having lost the lower town, the sea-coast, they should keep only the upper city. And, well, these Sibyls, perhaps Cassandras, but they tend to be Sibyls, right? they spent a lot of time learning about the political and other sorts of situations like that. You know, and I'm reminded about, the Medinat an-Nabi. There's these there's these hills, and there's supposed to be white palaces up there at some point. Now there's the white palaces, and you be careful. These people that take over these hills up here. So rather than so there has been a lapse that has allowed certain things to come forth, and the great enemy is supposed to take over from that palace and wreak a havoc that hasn't quite happened yet, but it is a strategic position if you have a big enough force and stuff to beat the people up in the hills, and that pretty much applies anywhere, right? Manilus was sufficient security that the garrison should behave itself inoffensively, but those who were now excluded from the franchise by property amounted to more than 12,000, so that both those that remained in the city thought themselves oppressed and shamefully used, and those who on this account left their homes and went away into Thrac, where Antipater offered them a town and some territory to inhabit, regarded themselves only as a colony of slaves and exiles, and when to this was added the deaths of Demosthenes at Calauria and of Hyperidas at Clana, as we have elsewhere related, the citizens began to think with regret of Philip and Alexander, and almost to wish the return of those times, and as after Antigonus was slain, when those that had taken him off were afflicting and oppressing the people, a countryman to Phrygia, digging in the fields, was asked what he was doing. I am, said he, fetching a deep sigh, searching for Antigonus. So said many that remembered those days, and the contests they had with those kings, whose anger, however great, was yet generous and placable, whereas Antipater, with the counterfeit humility of appearing like a private man in the meanness of his dress and homely fare, merely belied his real love of that arbitrary power which he exercised as a cruel master and despot to distress those under his command. Yet Phocion had interest with him to recall many from banishment by his intercession, and prevailed also for those who were driven out, that they might not, like others, be hurried beyond Taenarus and the mountains at Caraunia, but remained in Greece. Now, I don't know the verb or whatnot that you're saying, but the C's are K's, so because it's Greek, but and plant themselves in Peloponnesus, of which number was Agnonidas the sycophant. He was no less studious to manage the affairs within the city with equity and moderation, preferring constantly those that were men of worth and good education to the magistracies, and recommending the busy and turbulent talkers, to whom it was a mortal blow to be excluded from office and public debating, to learn to stay at home and be content to till their land, and observing that Xenocrates paid his alien tax as a foreigner. Not alien, as a foreigner. Not the other thing. He offered to him the freedom of the city, which he refused, saying he could not accept a franchise which had been sent as an ambassador to depreciate. Which he had sent as an ambassador to depreciate. Manilus wished to give Phocion a considerable present of money, who, thanking him, said, Neither was Menelaus greater than Alexander, nor his own occasions more urgent to receive it now than when he refused it from him, and on his pressing him to permit his son Phocas to receive it, he replied, "If my son returns to a right mind, his patrimony is sufficient. If not, all supplies will be insufficient." But to Antipater he answered more sharply, who would have him engaged in something dishonorable. Antipater, said he, cannot have me both as his friend and his flatterer. And indeed Antipater was wont to say he had two friends at Athens, Phocion and Demedas. The one would never suffer him to gratify him at all. The other would never be satisfied. Phocion might well think poverty of virtue, in which, after having so often been the general of the Athenians and admitted to the friendship of the potentates and princes, he had now grown old. Demedas, meantime, delighted in lavishing his wealth, even in the positive transgressions of the law. For there having been an order that no foreigner should be hired to dance in any chorus, on the penalty of a fine of 1,000 drachmas on the exhibitor, he had the vanity to exhibit an entire chorus of 100 foreigners, and paid down the penalty of 1,000 drachmas a head upon the stage itself. Marrying his son Demeas, he told him with the like vanity, "My son, when I married your mother, it was done so privately, it was not known to the next neighbors, but kings and princes give presents at your nuptials." The garrisons in Manichaea continued to be felt as a great grievance, and the Athenians did not cease to importunate upon Phocion to prevail with Antipater for its removal, but whether he despaired of effecting it, or perhaps observed the people to be more orderly, and public matters more reasonably conducted, by the awe that was thus created, he constantly declined the office, and contented himself with obtaining from Antipater the postponement for the present of the payment of the sum of money in which the city was fined. So the people, leaving him off, applied themselves to Demedas, who readily undertook the employment, and took along with him his son also into Macedonia, and some superior power, as it seemed. So ordering it, he came just at that nick of time when Antipater was already seized with his sickness, and Cassander taking upon himself the command, and found a letter of Demodes's, formally written by him to Antigonus in Asia, recommending him to come and possess himself of the empire of Greek and Macedon. Now hanging, he said, a scoff at Antipater, by an old and rotten thread. So when Cassander saw him come, he seized him, and first brought out the son, and killed him so close before his face that the blood ran all over his clothes and person, and then, after bitterly taunting and upbraiding him with his ingratitude and treachery, dispatched him himself. Antipater being dead, after nominating Pelasperchon general-in-chief and Cassander commander of the cavalry, Cassander at once set up for himself and immediately dispatched Nicanor to Menelaus to succeed him in the command of the garrison, commanding him to possess himself of Manichaea before the news of Antipater's death should be heard, which being done, and some days after the Athenians, hearing the report of it, Phocion was so taxed as privy to it before, and censured heavily for dissembling it out of friendship for Nicanor. But he slighted their talk, and making it his duty to visit and confer continually with Nicander, he succeeded in procuring his goodwill and kindness for the Athenians, and induced him even to put himself to trouble and expense to seek popularity with them, by undertaking the office of presiding at the games. In the meantime, Polysperchon, who was entrusted with the charge of the king to countermine Cassander, sent a letter to the city, declaring in the name of the king that he restored them their democracy, and that the whole Athenian people were at liberty to conduct their commonwealth according to their ancient customs and constitutions. The object of these pretenses was merely the overthrow of Phocion's influence, as the event manifested, for Polysperchon's design being to possess himself of the city, he despaired altogether of bringing it to pass while Phocion retained his credit, and the most certain way to ruin him would be again to fill the city with a crowd of disenfranchised citizens, and let loose the tongues of the demagogues and the common accusers. With this prospect the Athenians were all in excitement, and Nicanor wishing to confer with them on the subject. At a meeting of the council in Piraeus came himself, trusting for the safety of his person to Phocion, and when Dryden, who commanded the guard there, made an attempt to seize him, upon notice of it beforehand, he made his escape, and there was little doubt he would now lose no time in righting himself upon the city for the affront. And when Phocion was found fault with for letting him get off and not securing him, he defended himself by saying that he had no mistrust of Nicanor, nor the least reason to expect any mischief from him, but should it prove otherwise, for his part, he would have them all know he would rather receive than do the wrong, for and so far as he spoke for himself alone, the answer was honorable and high-minded enough, but he who hazards his country safely, and that too when he is her magistrate and chief commander, can scarcely be acquitted, I fear, of transgressing a higher and more sacred obligation of justice which he owed to his fellow citizens, for it will not even do to say that he dreaded the involving of the city in war by seizing Nicanor, and hoping by professions of confidence and just dealing to retain him in the observance of the like, but it was indeed his credulity and confidence in him, and an overweening opinion of his sincerity, that imposed upon him, so that notwithstanding the sundry intimations he had of his making preparations to attack Piraeus, sending soldiers over to Salamis, and tampering with and endeavoring to corrupt various residents in Piraeus, he would, notwithstanding all the evidence, never be persuaded to believe it, and even when Philomedes of Lampra had got a decree passed that all the Athenians should stand to their arms and be ready to follow Phocion for their general, and yet he sat and did nothing till Nicanor actually led his troops out from Manakia and drew trenches about Piraeus, upon which, when Phocion at last would have let out the Athenians, they cried out against him and slighted his orders. Alexander, the son of Polysperchon, was at hand with a considerable force, and professed to come to give them succor against Nicanor, but intended nothing less, if possible, than to surprise the city, whilst they were in tumult and divided among themselves, for all that had previously been expelled from the city, now coming back with him, made their way into it, and were joined by a mixed multitude of foreigners and disenfranchised persons, and of these a motley and irregular public assembly came together, in which they presently divested Phocion of all power and chose other generals. And if by chance Alexander had not been spied from the walls alone in close conference with Nicanor, and had not this, which was often repeated, given the Athenians cause of suspicion, the city had